Chapter 1, The Quiet Quit. Marshal Kurt did not wake up one morning and decide to leave his wife. That distinction mattered to him more than he expected. The leaving, he would later understand, was simply the first visible symptom of something that had been over for months, maybe longer. Long before the empty guest room nights. Long before the unanswered texts that sat unread until morning. Long before the way Tanya had begun kissing him like a habit she meant to break. For 8 years, Marshal had believed they were doing fine. Good even. The ordinary kind of good people were supposed to be grateful for. They had met in their 20s, grown into their 30s together, learned each other's rhythms, settled comfortably into shared routines. Marriage had felt like a continuation, not a shift. For years of it had passed without major incident. Then, slowly, imperceptibly at first, Tanya began living a life that did not require him to be present. It started with drinks after work. Just one, she'd said that first time, slipping on her shoes while Marshal stood by the kitchen counter slicing onions for dinner. We had a long day. Sure, he'd replied easily. I'll keep it warm. She'd come home just after 9, smelling like citrus vodka and laughter, had kissed him quickly, apologized absently, and gone straight to bed. He hadn't thought twice about it. But one drink became 2. 2 became a couple nights a week. A couple nights became 3 or 4, then most of them, then nearly all. Weekends followed. Fridays turned into Saturdays. Saturdays bled into Sundays. Sometimes she didn't come home at all. I stayed at Marcy's, she would say, as if reporting the weather. Too much wine. Marshal learned not to ask follow-up questions. Not because he suspected infidelity, he didn't, but because something about her tone made it clear the details weren't for him anymore. At first, he told himself to be reasonable. She's just blowing off steam, he said aloud to no one. Work is stressful, he reassured himself while doing laundry alone at midnight. Marriage isn't supposed to be clingy, he thought while eating reheated pasta at the counter for the 3rd night in a row. He became the stabilizing force without being asked. The one who remembered trash day, who paid the bills, who got the oil changed, who noticed when the mail piled up. He did not resent it at first, but the intimacy disappeared with a quiet finality that unsettled him. He tried once or twice, a hand on her back in the kitchen, a kiss that lingered a moment too long, an arm around her waist in bed. I'm exhausted, she'd said gently, already turning away. Another night. Can we not right now? Another. I've got an early morning. Weeks passed, then months. Marshal stopped reaching. By the 6th month, it wasn't unusual for Tanya to be gone for days at a time. She returned cheerful, energized, entirely unburdened by guilt or secrecy. She did not hide her phone, did not bristle at questions, did not act as though she were doing anything wrong. In a way, that was the worst part. It meant she truly believed this arrangement was acceptable, meaningful, permanent. Marshal realized one night, standing barefoot on the back porch while the cicadas screamed into the dark, that his wife no longer experienced absence when he wasn't there. She experienced convenience. The decision came quietly after that. Not in anger, not in a fight. There was no dramatic confrontation or teary ultimatum. Just a morning where he woke up, watched sunlight creep across the ceiling, and felt an unexpected calm. He made an appointment with a lawyer that afternoon. The office smelled like lemon cleaner and ambition. The lawyer, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and meticulously neutral makeup, listened without interrupting while Marshal explained. When he finished, she folded her hands and said, "You already have grounds." "For what?" Marshal asked. "Marital abandonment," she replied matter-of-factly. "Extended absence. Deprivation of intimacy. Courts take that seriously." He sat there, absorbing that his loneliness had been given a legal name. "How long would it take?" he asked. "As long as you're willing to wait," she said. "But from what you've told me, you don't have to." He didn't wait. He signed everything without argument. Signed over the house, the furniture, the shared accounts, anything with emotional residue attached to it, he left behind like an offering. The only things he kept were his savings and the cash already in his wallet. When the papers were ready, Marshal went home early on a Wednesday and packed nothing. He laid his wedding ring carefully on the center of the kitchen table, placed the divorce papers beside it, set his phone face down on top, as if returning a borrowed item. He considered leaving a note, something explanatory, something kind, something devastating. He didn't. There was no point explaining a silence she'd been practicing for months. Marshal stepped out the door with his wallet and his keys, then turned back, removed the keys, and left them next to the phone. When he closed the door behind him, the house didn't feel abandoned, felt relieved. He drove down the street without a plan, without a destination, and without the faintest intention of being found. For the first time in a year, Marshal Kurt was not waiting for someone to come home. And for the first time, the future felt wide open, terrifying, unfamiliar, and quietly his. Chapter 2, Nowhere on Purpose. Marshal drove for nearly an hour before he realized he didn't know where he was going. That realization didn't bring panic. It brought something closer to relief. He stopped at a gas station on the edge of town, bought a bottle of water and a granola bar he didn't want, and and leaned against his car while the sun dipped low enough to soften the edges of everything. The world felt quieter without Tanya's schedule dictating the tempo of his days. No waiting for headlights in the driveway. No checking the clock to see whether it was still reasonable to expect her home. Just him, his car, and an unsettling amount of freedom. He drove east because west felt too deliberate. The highway thinned, replaced by smaller roads lined with trees that leaned inward as if gossiping. He passed towns without names big enough to stick, clusters of buildings that announced themselves with a diner, a barber shop, and a sign warning drivers to slow down as though the place itself might step into the road. Marshall didn't stop until hunger turned from concept to problem. That was how he found Bellhaven. It wasn't charming in the polished, brochure sense. It was quiet in a way that suggested most of its residents were either very old or very uninterested in novelty. A hand-painted sign welcomed him. The paint faded unevenly, the lettering hopeful if not optimistic. He pulled into a diner that looked like it had been renovated at least once by someone who loved it deeply and poorly. Inside, the air smelled like coffee and something fried that had been fried a long time ago and would probably be fried again. A woman behind the counter glanced up. "You passing through?" she said, not a question. "For now," Marshall replied. She nodded, satisfied. "Sit anywhere you like. Menu's more of a suggestion." Marshall took a booth by the window. He ordered eggs. They arrived faster than logic suggested. He ate slowly, noticing the way the town seemed to move in low gear. A man in a fishing hat argued gently with a woman about newspaper delivery schedules. Someone laughed too loudly. A bell on the door jingled every few minutes, never in a hurry. It occurred to Marshall, mid-bite, that no one in this town knew him. Not his name, not his job, not the fact that he'd failed at something he'd intended to protect with everything he had. The idea settled into him easily. After finishing, he paid in cash and asked the woman behind the counter if there was somewhere to stay. She jerked her chin toward the window. "Blue house 2 blocks down. Mrs. Calder rents rooms. Been doing it longer than she'll admit." Marshall followed the directions, found the house, and knocked before he could talk himself out of it. Mrs. Calder answered the door wearing a cardigan that suggested she distrusted air conditioning. "You look lost," she said. "I am," Marshall replied honestly. She studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. "That's fine. Lost people pay just like found ones." The room she showed him was small but clean, the bed firm, the window overlooking a yard someone had given up on but not entirely abandoned. The rent was reasonable, the rules minimal. Marshall paid for a month. That night, lying on unfamiliar sheets, he reached instinctively for the phone that wasn't there. The absence startled him. Then it pleased him. The days that followed arranged themselves with a simplicity that felt almost radical. Marshall woke early because his body still believed mornings mattered. He walked the town, learned its rhythms. He found a coffee shop that only pretended to be modern and a hardware store that sold advice with every purchase. He didn't tell anyone why he was there. No one asked. On his third morning in Bellhaven, Marshall wandered into a bookstore that seemed to operate under the assumption that anyone who entered had already decided to stay a while. The shelves were mismatched, the lighting uneven. A chalkboard by the door announced an event that had clearly already happened. Behind the counter stood a woman with her hair twisted up in a way that looked accidental but was probably deliberate. She flipped a page, paused, frowned at something, then glanced up at him. "You're staring at the travel section like it owes you money," she said. Marshall blinked. "I didn't realize I was staring." "You were. It's a thing," she said, closing her book. "People who plan to leave but won't." He smiled despite himself. "What if I already left?" She considered him again, sharper this time. "Then you'd be staring at fiction." He glanced down. He was, "Well," he said, "that's unsettling." She grinned. "Lena, I run this chaos." "Marshall." She tilted her head. "That's a first name that sounds like it comes with responsibility." "I'm taking a break from that," he said. "Good. Responsibility pairs poorly with paperbacks and coffee." Over the next half hour, Marshall bought a book he didn't need and stayed long enough to learn that Lena had been in Bellhaven most of her life and intended to be there until the town either revived or died quietly. "Either way," she said, "I'll have front row seating." He left the bookstore lighter than when he'd entered, unsettled in a new and interesting way. That afternoon, Mrs. Calder mentioned that the Johnson place down the street needed a fence repaired. Marshall volunteered without considering why. The work was familiar, measuring, hammering, adjusting angles that never quite wanted to cooperate. The difference was in how it felt doing it for people who thanked him like he'd offered something generous instead of necessary. By the end of the week, he had 3 offers for odd jobs and more casual conversations than he'd had at home in months. One evening, he ran into Lena again, this time at the same diner that had introduced him to Bellhaven. She slid into the booth across from him without asking. "You look less haunted," she said. "Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation. Compliments are conditional." He laughed, surprising himself with the ease of it. They talked. About books. About towns that refused to grow. About the strange comfort of being known only briefly. When Marshall walked back to Mrs. Calder's house under a sky loud with stars, he realized something else he hadn't expected. He wasn't waiting anymore. Not for reconciliation. Not for closure. Not for someone else to tell him what he was allowed to want. Bellhaven hadn't fixed anything, but it had given him space. And space, he was learning, was not absence. It was possibility. Chapter 3, The Woman Who Notices Too Much. Marshal learned quickly that Lena Brooks did not do casual conversation. She did conversational reconnaissance. The second time he entered the bookstore that week, she looked up from behind the counter and said, "You're limping." "I'm not," Marshal replied automatically. "You are," she said, already moving. She stopped a few feet away, crouched and pointed. "See that shift? You're compensating on the left." He stared at her. "You're a bookseller. I contain multitudes." He exhaled a laugh. "Fence post." "Ah," she said, standing. "Splinters or gravity?" "Gravity won. Always does," she said. "Ice helps. Also ibuprofen. Don't be a hero." "I thought heroes limped less." She smiled thinly. "That's propaganda." Marshal bought another book he didn't need, mostly because lingering without one felt rude. Lena rang him up and slid the receipt across the counter. "So," she said lightly, "how long are you staying?" He paused. Just a flicker, but she caught it. "Undecided," he said carefully. "That's not a duration," she replied. "That's avoidance." He met her gaze. "You're very observant." "I have a slow town and too many mirrors," she said. "People get interesting when they're trying not to be." Marshal left with the hum of that sentence following him down the street. By Friday, Bellhaven had acquired an informal understanding of Marshal Kurt. He was the new guy, which in a town this size came with both scrutiny and acceptance. He fixed things. He smiled politely. He did not overshare. This made him popular with older residents and deeply suspicious to everyone else. Mrs. Calder began sending him off with leftovers he didn't ask for but accepted gratefully. The Johnsons paid him in cash and insisted on lemonade breaks. Someone named Earl stopped him outside the hardware store and asked if he did decks. "I do now," Marshal replied. The work filled his days in a way that felt honest. No performance reviews. No shared calendars. No sense that he was maintaining something for someone else's comfort. Each nail driven was visible proof of effort. Each repaired hinge did what it was supposed to do. On Saturday morning, he was repairing a porch railing when Lena appeared at the bottom of the steps holding 2 coffees. "You look like you could use a bribe," she said. "I'm on my break," he replied, straightening. "Perfect," she said, handing him a cup. "Now we're both committing minor offenses." They sat on the steps, shoulder to shoulder but not touching. "This town hires you officially yet?" she asked. "Unofficially, I think," he said. "Word gets around faster than paperwork." She sipped her coffee. "You're good at this. Fixing broken things? Making them feel wanted again," she said. "Subtle difference." Marshal considered that. "I just do the work." "That's the trick," she said. "Most people want credit." A breeze moved through the yard, rustling weeds that hadn't been brave enough to die yet. "You married?" Lena asked suddenly. No preamble. No softening. Marshal froze just long enough to notice he'd done it. "Still," he said, then corrected himself. "Legally." She nodded once, as if that confirmed something she'd already filed away. "Separated. Divorcing. Recently?" He didn't answer right away. "Yes," he said finally. She waited. Silence stretched, not awkward, just present. "I didn't cheat if that's what you're thinking," he added, more sharply than intended. Lena looked at him then, not with judgment, not with pity, but with focus. "I wasn't," she said. "You don't have the posture." "The what?" "Guilty men lean forward," she said. "They're always trying to explain something no one asked. That's unsettlingly specific." "I told you," she said. "Multitudes." Marshal took another sip of coffee. Tasted better than it had a minute ago. "She left first," he said, surprising himself. "Just not officially." "That happens," Lena replied. "People leave without packing." They sat a while longer, until the coffee was gone and the sun had shifted enough to remind Marshal he had work to finish. "You can come by the shop later," Lena said, standing. "I'm cataloging donations. It's miserable." "I'm sensing an invitation cloaked as a complaint," he said. "That's my brand." Later that afternoon, Marshal showed up at the bookstore with sawdust still clinging to his jeans. Lena was knee-deep in boxes, muttering under her breath. "Interrupted the misery schedule?" he asked. She looked up, hair coming loose. "You're early. Didn't want you suffering without witnesses." She snorted. "Grab that box. If I'm crushed under outdated encyclopedias, tell people I died bravely." They worked side by side, pulling out books, sorting them into piles. Some were water-damaged. Some smelled faintly of cats. Some, surprisingly, were first editions hidden among junk like treasure someone had forgotten they owned. Lena grew animated when she talked about the books, her hands moving, her words quick but deliberate. Marshal found himself watching her instead of listening at times, noting how she leaned into subjects she cared about and shut down entirely around ones she didn't. "You missed one," she said. tapping a paperback he'd set aside. I thought it was romance. It is, she said. That's not a crime. Debatable. She gave him a look. Oh, so you're one of those. One of what? Men afraid of feelings with covers, she said. Don't worry. It's common. Curable, but common. Marshall smiled, then faltered as the word feelings landed a little too close to home. Lena noticed. Hey, she said, gentler now. I don't pry to hurt. I know, he said, and he did. As the afternoon dimmed, rain began tapping insistently against the windows. Lena locked the door and turned on a lamp that cast the shop in a warmer glow. Storm like this, you'll get stuck here, she said. There are worse fates. She glanced at him, a smile threatening, then gone. Listen, she said. I'm not asking for details, but if you need space, or noise, or coffee and a woman who will call you on your nonsense but not demand explanations. I appreciate that, Marshall said, and meant it more than he could articulate. The rain passed as quickly as it arrived. When Marshall stepped outside, the air felt washed clean, edges sharper. That night, he lay in bed at Mrs. Calder's house staring at the ceiling, thinking not of Tanya, but of Lena's eyes when she paid attention, how they missed nothing and judged little. He realized, with a start, that being seen did not have to be defended against. Could be an offer. And maybe, just maybe, Bellhaven was not a place he was passing through. It was a place giving him room to choose. Chapter 4, Small Town, Big Adjustments. If Bellhaven had a rhythm, Marshall slipped into it without trying. He woke early because the town did. Because Mrs. Calder's radio hummed softly through the walls before sunrise. Because the birds apparently held meetings at dawn. And because his body no longer believed sleep was meant to be escaped. He drank coffee at the small kitchen table, nodded to Mrs. Calder when she appeared like a benevolent ghost, and stepped outside with a day that had not yet decided what it wanted from him. By midweek, his name had begun circulating with a specificity that amused him. That's Marshall. He fixed the Henderson gate. Marshall? The tall one. With the quiet voice. He's staying by Mrs. Calder's. Don't know how long. Marshall didn't correct anyone. He didn't clarify permanence or lack thereof. For once, ambiguity felt like shelter instead of evasion. He worked steadily. Porch stairs one morning. A sagging mailbox the next. Earl's deck, which turned out to be less deck and more philosophical question. Occupied 2 full afternoons and 1 beer-drinking supervisory session that yielded more commentary than assistance. You married? Earl asked, leaning on a railing that absolutely should not have been leaned on. Was, Marshall replied, tightening a bolt. Earl nodded like this explained many things. Happens. That was it. No follow-up. No advice. No attempt to teach him anything about women involving fish metaphors. Marshall found himself startled by how little he missed explaining. It was Thursday when he realized he was laughing more than he wasn't. The realization came mid-sentence, while standing in the hardware store listening to the owner, Frank, recount a story about an attempt to repaint the town sign that had resulted in 3 different shades of blue and an emergency town meeting. Marshall laughed. Not politely, not reflexively, but genuinely, and stopped short. The sound surprised him. He hadn't meant to be guarded. It had just happened somewhere along the way, his emotions tucking themselves neatly out of reach. Now they seemed to be peeking out like children testing curfews. That evening, Lena found him closing up repairs on a picnic table behind the community center. You're becoming a fixture, she said, hands in her jacket pockets. Careful. That's how they get you. Fixing things? He asked. Letting you matter, she replied. He glanced at her. Is that dangerous? For some people, she said. It can be. They sat at the end of the table, the wood still warm from the sun. I've been meaning to ask, Marshall said. Why Bellhaven? Lena raised an eyebrow. You think people only stay places accidentally? I think people with options usually leave, he said carefully. She considered him for a long moment. I left once, she said. Came back. Turns out leaving doesn't always mean progress. That didn't feel like a confession so much as a boundary marker. Marshall respected it. He didn't tell her that for him. Leaving had felt like breathing after being underwater too long. That he was afraid progress might require him to stay put and confront what he'd been avoiding. They walked together toward the diner, not discussing dinner, not discussing plans, just moving in the same direction by unspoken agreement. Inside, the place buzzed softly. Usual faces, usual booths. Someone waved at Marshall, called his name like it had always belonged there. He felt something in his chest shift. Over coffee and pie, Lena studied him with that familiar precision. You're different today, she said. In what way? Present, she replied. Usually you're polite but buffered, like you're saving bandwidth. That obvious? To me, she said. Yes. He stirred his coffee. I think I stopped bracing for impact. She nodded slowly. That's a dangerous stage. How so? That's when hope sneaks in without permission. Marshall smiled faintly. You make it sound like a raccoon. It has teeth. Later, walking back through quiet streets, Marshall realized something else that unsettled him. He hadn't thought about Tanya all day. Not with anger. Not with longing. Not even with that dull ache of disbelief. Just absence. The revelation didn't hurt the way he expected. It didn't feel like betrayal or erasure. It felt like a door finally shutting against a draft he'd grown tired of tolerating. That night, he dreamt, not of his old house or empty rooms, but of standing in a place that felt unfinished in a way that invited participation. He woke with the sense that the next step would require intention. And maybe courage. Bellhaven wasn't fixing him, but it was asking him gently and persistently to stay awake. Chapter 5. The past has Wi-Fi. Marshall was tightening the last screw on a porch railing when his borrowed phone buzzed. He stared at it like it had spoken. The device sat on the step beside him, its case scuffed, screen smudged, courtesy of Mrs. Calder, who had insisted he take it in case of emergencies or raccoons, neither of which she elaborated on. He hadn't given the number to anyone beyond her and Lena. That, in his mind, was a closed system. The screen lit up again. Unknown number. Marshall wiped his hands on his jeans and picked it up. Hello. There was a pause. Not long, just long enough. Marshall. The voice landed like a dropped plate. Not shattering. Not gentle. Just unmistakably what it was. Tanya, he said. She exhaled. Relief threaded with offense. You're alive. Yes. Another pause. Longer this time. Why didn't you tell me where you were going? Marshall looked out over the street, at the familiar porch lines and the uneven shadows of late afternoon. You weren't home. That's not. She stopped herself. Switch tactics. You left your phone. And your ring. And papers, Marshall. Papers. I know. You didn't even leave a note. There didn't seem to be a good time. Her laugh was sharp. So you just disappeared? I moved out, he said evenly. Legally. Formally. With documentation. That's not the same thing. It is, he replied. You just didn't expect it. Silence swelled. Heavy now. Where are you? She asked. No, Marshall said. She scoffed. You owe me that much. I don't, he said quietly. I gave you everything else. She shifted, clearly pacing. This is impulsive. You're overreacting. Marshall almost smiled at that. The familiarity of being told his calm was hysteria. I waited, he said. I waited 7 months. You never said it was this serious. I tried to get your attention without competing for it. She inhaled as if to argue, then released it. Are you seeing someone? She asked abruptly. No. You hesitated. I considered whether that question mattered. It didn't land the way she expected. He could hear it. Come home, Tanya said, softer now. We can talk. Marshall closed his eyes. I am home, he replied. Just not with you. He ended the call before she could regroup. For a moment, the world felt unstable, like he'd leaned too far back in a chair and needed to recover balance he hadn't realized was threatened. He sat there longer than necessary, phone resting face down beside him. When he finally stood, Lena was at the edge of the sidewalk. You look like someone reopened a door you worked hard to shut, she said. Marshall stared. Do you materialize when drama peaks? Someone has to, she said. Mrs. Calder called. Said you sounded quiet. He let out a breath. She found me. Ah. Lena didn't ask how. She didn't ask what was said. She just nodded toward the diner. You eating? I think I need coffee, he said. Inside, the diner felt louder than usual. Marshall slid into a booth, Lena across from him. You don't have to explain, she said immediately. I want to, he replied. I just don't know where to start. Start where it stopped hurting, she suggested. That took him longer. She didn't cheat, he said at last. At least I don't think she did. But she left anyway. Just without leaving. Lena's jaw tightened, not in anger, but recognition. That kind of leaving convinces the other person they're imagining things, she said. Makes you doubt your own loneliness. Marshall nodded. She wanted the marriage to still exist, just without participation. And you? I wanted to matter. Lena reached across the table then. She didn't take his hand. She didn't need to. She rested her fingers near his knuckles. Close, intentional, warm. That's not a wild request, she said. Across the room, someone laughed too loudly. The cook's bell rang. Life continued, unapologetically ordinary. She's going to call again, Marshall said. Yes, Lena agreed. Probably when she realizes silence doesn't pull you back. I don't want to be cruel. You're not, she said. You're being clear. Marshall looked down at his coffee. I don't want to disappear again. Lena's expression softened. Not triumphant. Not hopeful. Just steady. Then don't, she said. Stay exactly where you are. He did. Chapter 6, almost isn't enough. The trouble with choosing not to disappear was that it required a kind of presence Marshall hadn't practiced in years. Not just physical presence, showing up, staying visible, but emotional availability. The willingness to be reacted to risk misunderstanding, to stand in the open without rehearsing an exit. Bellhaven made that harder in the gentlest ways possible. People noticed him now, expected him, called if he didn't show up when he said he would. Mrs. Calder knocked on his door if he skipped dinner. Frank saved him the good hardware discounts. Lena, especially Lena, looked at him like she expected answers to questions he hadn't figured out how to ask yet. They spent more time together, though neither of them labeled it. Coffee became routine. Walks through town happened without planning. He helped her fix a stubborn window in the bookstore. She helped him choose paint that didn't look emotionally unavailable, as she put it. There was laughter. There was ease. There was also restraint. Marshall noticed it most when they stood too close and didn't move away. When her shoulder brushed his arm and neither of them commented. When conversations dipped into personal territory and both instinctively turned slightly aside, as if to avoid collision. "You're careful," Lena said one evening as they closed the shop together. "So are you," Marshall replied. She locked the door, keys jingling. "Careful isn't my default. It's my learned behavior." "What taught you?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then, staying too long in something that was already gone. The words landed gently and heavily at the same time. They walked in silence after that, the kind that carried meaning without demanding response. The near miss happened on a Tuesday. It was raining, one of those steady, committed rains that flatten time. Marshall had finished early and ended up at the bookstore again, watching Lena reorganize a shelf she'd clearly reorganized 3 times already. "You're hovering," she said without looking up. "I'm available," he countered. She snorted. Dangerous trait. He took a book from her stack, pretended to read the back, then glanced at her. Her hair was down, damp from the rain, clinging to her neck. She looked tired. "Real. You okay?" he asked. She hesitated. "Just enough." "Mostly," she said. "Today's a day where almost wins." He frowned. "Wins what?" "Nothing big." She waved it off. "Old stuff." Marshall stepped closer without thinking. When she looked up, they were suddenly inside each other's space. The moment stretched. This was where he would have waited before, paused, assessed risk, chosen stillness in the name of self-control. Instead, he leaned in. Lena didn't pull away. For the briefest instant, it felt simple, natural, earned. Then she stepped back. Not sharply, not angrily, just decisively. "No," she said. "Not like that." His heart dropped, confused. "I didn't mean." "I know," she said. "That's the problem." He stared at her, words failing. "You're still half braced for leaving," she continued, voice calm but firm. "And I'm not a landing pad." Marshall stiffened. "I'm not using you." "I didn't say you were," she replied. "I said you're not fully here yet. That's not fair." She winced just slightly. Probably true, but it is accurate. The rain picked up outside, drumming insistently against the windows like a distraction begging to be acknowledged. Marshall took a step back himself now. Space returned, unwelcome but necessary. "I thought being honest was enough," he said. Lena's expression softened. "Honesty is the entry fee. Presence is the commitment." He grabbed his jacket, suddenly too aware of the quiet. "I should go." She nodded. "Probably." He left without slamming the door, without drama, without running. But the walk home felt longer than usual. That night, Mrs. Calder didn't knock. Marshall lay awake replaying the moment, the restraint, the truth that had slipped underneath his intentions. He hadn't meant to hurt Lena, but meaning hadn't saved his marriage either. For the first time since leaving, Marshall felt something dangerously close to regret. Not for walking away from Tanya, but for arriving in Bellhaven unfinished and expecting that to be enough. Almost, Lena had said, and almost, he realized, had been his whole life. Chapter 7, Choosing Presence. Marshall didn't avoid the bookstore. That surprised him. He expected himself to take the long way around town, to invent errands on the opposite side of Bellhaven, to turn absence into something that felt like dignity. He'd spent years perfecting that instinct, how to withdraw without being accused of leaving. Instead, he walked past the shop every morning. Sometimes the lights were on. Sometimes they weren't. Sometimes Lena's bike leaned against the brick wall out back, bright and stubborn. He didn't go in. Presence, he was learning, wasn't the same as intrusion. He worked harder than usual that week, filling his days with tangible tasks. Fixing a rotted step behind the library. Reinforcing a fence whose owner insisted on telling the story of its collapse 3 times. Each version more heroic. Painting. Measuring. Remeasuring. Physical labor had always been his refuge. You could solve problems with your hands or at least see how they resisted being solved. People were less compliant. But even as he worked, his mind kept circling back to Lena's words. Honesty is the entry fee. Presence is the commitment. Presence meant staying emotionally when staying felt risky. It meant not using the safety net of impermanence. Not telling himself that if things went wrong, he could just disappear cleanly and quietly like before. On Friday evening, Mrs. Calder set a plate in front of him and watched him poke at it. "You in trouble?" she asked. "I don't think so," Marshall said. "But I might be on the edge of doing better." She nodded, considering. "That can be destabilizing." He smiled. "You're very wise for someone who warns people about raccoons. They are ungovernable," she said solemnly. "So are men in transition." Later that night, walking past the bookstore again, including the dim light on inside, Marshall stopped. For once, he didn't overthink it. He went in. Lena looked up from behind the counter, surprise flashing quickly across her face before she masked it. "We're closed," she said. "I know," Marshall replied. "I'm not here to shop." She waited. "I'm here because I didn't disappear," he continued. "And because I don't want to almost this again." The silence that followed was heavy, but not hostile. Lena set her pen down carefully. "Say what you mean." Marshall took a breath. His chest felt tight, not with fear, but with clarity that had nowhere to hide. "I've spent a long time being good at leaving without making noise," he said. "I convinced myself that restraint was the same as respect, that if I didn't ask for too much, I couldn't be disappointed." She didn't interrupt. "I don't want to do that anymore," he went on. "With you. With anyone." Lena's expression softened, but she didn't smile. "That's a declaration," she said. "Those usually come with conditions." "I'm still untangling things," he admitted. "I'm divorced in progress. I don't have this all mapped out. But I'm here. Not hovering. Not halfway out the door." She studied him like a paragraph that demanded a second reading. "Why now?" she asked. "Because you noticed when I wasn't," he said simply. "And because you were right." A beat passed, then another. Finally, Lena exhaled and leaned back against the counter. "You know," she said, "I don't need certainty. I need intention." "That I have," Marshall said. "Even if I'm learning how to aim it." She smiled then, not triumphant, not cautious. Just real. "Okay," she said. "Then let's start with coffee. In public. No declarations. No rescue narratives." "I can do coffee," he said, relief threading through him. "I'm excellent at coffee." They walked out together, locked the shop, and stepped into the evening. The town greeted them as if it had been waiting. At the diner, Bellhaven did what it always did, noticed. "You two finally figure it out?" Frank called from behind the counter. "Figure what out?" Lena replied amicably. Frank shrugged. "Something." Marshall laughed, the sound easy now, unchecked. It felt like choosing something, not because it rescued him, not because it distracted him, but because it required him to stay awake and accountable. Halfway through the coffee, Lena reached across the table. Not to test boundaries, not to demand reassurance. Just to be there. Marshall matched the gesture, steady and unafraid. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't preparing for departure. He was choosing presence. Chapter 8, A Different Kind of Marriage. Marshall had never thought much about promises. Not the loud kind, at least. Not declarations shouted over candlelight or etched into metal bands. Promises, he had learned, could be kept with perfect sincerity and still miss the point entirely. Bellhaven, inconveniently, had opinions about this. "They're practically married," Mrs. Calder announced one morning, setting a teacup down with finality. "Just without the paperwork and the arguing about curtains." Marshall nearly choked on his toast. "We've been having coffee." "Dangerous gateway," she replied, unfazed. "One thing leads to another." Marshall decided not to ask her what exactly tended to follow caffeine. Things with Lena had settled into something both deliberate and light. They saw each other most days, but not in a way that felt habitual. Every meeting was chosen. A walk here, dinner there, an afternoon spent fixing a rolling ladder in the bookstore that had never once behaved itself. They talked, really talked, but without excavation. Histories surfaced naturally, not dragged into daylight for inspection. Lena knew about the divorce proceedings. He knew she'd stayed once when she should have left and left once when staying would have been easier. What neither of them did was rush to define what they were building. That restraint did not go unnoticed. "You're taking it seriously," Frank observed one afternoon as Marshall paid for a box of screws he definitely didn't need. "That usually means it'll either last or break spectacularly." "That's encouraging," Marshall said. Frank shrugged. "Life's messy. Serious people just clean up after themselves." Marshall found that advice unexpectedly comforting. The divorce finalized on a Thursday. There was no notification ceremony. No sense of release that felt cinematic. Just an email forwarded from the lawyer, confirmation neat and bloodless. He read it twice, then once more, slower. When he closed his laptop, he didn't feel free. He felt finished. That evening, he told Lena while they walked along the water just outside town. The sky streaked pink and copper like it was trying to impress someone. She stopped walking, looked at him. "And?" she asked. "And that's it," Marshall said. "It's done." She nodded. "How do you feel?" He considered the honest answer. "Like I outgrew something that didn't notice." "That's a good feeling," she said. "Quiet. Durable." They resumed walking. He didn't miss the marriage. Not the shape of it at the end. What he missed, he realized, was the early belief that commitment alone could carry two people forward even if only one was walking. Later that night, sitting on the steps of Mrs. Calder's house, Lena tucked her feet under her and watched the stars. "I used to think I didn't believe in marriage," she said casually. Marshall glanced at her, surprised but careful not to interrupt. "I do," she continued. "I just don't believe in the version where people promise permanence instead of presence." He nodded slowly. "I promised permanence. and did everything else with presence, she said. The order just matters more than people admit. The idea settled between them, comfortable as shared silence. Weeks passed. Marshall took on a longer-term project helping renovate the community center. Lena hosted a reading night that drew more people than expected, including 2 who stayed for the entire thing and 1 who only came for the snacks. One afternoon, while sorting paint cans, someone asked Marshall if he planned on staying in Bellhaven. He surprised himself by answering without hesitation. Yes. It wasn't a sacrifice. It wasn't a compromise. It was a choice. The realization arrived fully formed. That night, he told Lena, "I'm staying," he said, not as a proposal, not as a question. Just truth. She smiled. "I already knew." "How?" "You stopped packing your life into sentences," she said. The summer settled in, warm and unhurried. Bellhaven thrived on that energy, hosting impromptu block dinners and events no one remembered scheduling. Marshall found himself part of the infrastructure now, not maintaining someone else's life, but contributing to a shared one. One evening, they were closing up the bookstore again. Lena locked the door, then hesitated. "You ever want to get married again?" she asked casually, like she might ask about lunch plans. Marshall leaned against the brick wall, considering not what sounded right, but what felt solid. "Yes," he said, "but not soon. And not the way I did before. I don't want rings that make noise when people stop listening," she said. "Me neither." She smiled, satisfied. "Good." They stood there, not rushing anything. The town lit softly behind them. It struck Marshall then how different this felt. Not better in a sweeping, dramatic sense, but steadier. Like a structure built with intention instead of expectation. Marriage, he realized, wasn't an ending. It was a daily decision to show up awake. And this time, he was choosing it with his eyes open. Chapter 9, The Long Way Home. Marshall learned the shape of home slowly. Not as a place with walls and doors and systems that hummed reliably in the background, but as a collection of ordinary moments that asked for his participation. Home, he discovered, did not announce itself. It accumulated. The first time he noticed it distinctly was banal enough to be missed if he hadn't been paying attention. He was standing in the community center's half-finished kitchen with Earl and Frank, arguing earnestly about whether the cabinets should be mounted half an inch higher to accommodate taller volunteers. Lena sat on the counter with a clipboard, pretending to take notes while very clearly not doing that. "You're all wrong," she said finally. "No one needs extra clearance to feel powerful in a kitchen." "That's not," Earl began. Marshall laughed, out loud, without checking himself. The sound rang through the room and everything paused just long enough for him to realize he wasn't cataloging exits anymore. He wasn't measuring outcomes. He was simply there, invested, amused, engaged. Afterward, as people drifted away, Lena slid down from the counter and handed him the clipboard. "You did good today," she said. "At cabinetry?" "At staying," she replied. They walked back toward her place together, the path illuminated by porch lights and the stubborn glow of a town that didn't believe in dramatic lighting. The night was warm, the kind of warm that didn't ask you to rush. "Do you think people can come back from quiet endings?" Marshall asked suddenly. Lena glanced sideways. "Most endings are quiet," she said. "We just pretend they're explosions so they feel important." He nodded. "I used to think leaving meant failure. And now, I think staying asleep might be worse," he said. She smiled, and this time there was no restraint in it. Just recognition. The weeks that followed were steady in the best way. Not uneventful, Bellhaven didn't allow for that, but grounded. Marshall moved out of Mrs. Calder's house and into a small rental near the water that creaked with personality and optimism. Mrs. Calder hugged him with surprising strength and told him he was welcome back for dinner whenever he forgot where he came from. He fixed the screen door in his new place, hung shelves, learned which floorboard protested near the window. Lena kept her routines. The bookstore thrived quietly. On Thursday nights, they hosted readings that ranged from moving to deeply confusing. Marshall went every time, listening with the attentiveness of someone who had learned the value of being present for other people's stories. They didn't rush declarations. They didn't need to. One Sunday afternoon, they sat on the worn couch in her living room, legs tangled without commentary, reading separate books. The windows were open. Someone was playing music badly somewhere nearby. Lena closed her book first. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "this is the longest I've gone without feeling like I need to protect myself from inevitability." Marshall marked his page. "I don't think inevitability is real." She looked at him. "That's a bold claim." "I think there are only choices we make repeatedly and call fate when we get tired," he said. She considered that. "I like that version better." Later, curled together without ceremony, Marshall felt something settle into place. Not excitement or triumph, but alignment. The quiet assurance that came from choosing the same direction day after day. He thought briefly of his old house, of the way it had felt to keep everything running while slowly being uninvited from his own marriage. The resentment he'd suffocated under the guise of understanding. He didn't feel anger anymore. He felt relief that he'd listened when the silence finally became too loud to endure. On a cool evening near the end of summer, Lena found him on the dock watching the water darken. "You look thoughtful," she said. "I was thinking about rings," he admitted. She stilled. Not alarmed. Attentive. "Not now," he added quickly. "Not even soon. Just someday." She relaxed, smiling. "I don't hate someday. I don't want to promise permanence," he continued. "I want to promise effort, tension, honesty even when it's inconvenient." She sat beside him, shoulder to shoulder. "That's the only kind of promise I believe in," she said. "Anything else is a performance." They stayed there until the stars came out, the water reflecting them in fractured pieces. Marshall realized then that he didn't feel like he was starting over. He felt like he was continuing, with intention this time. Leaving Tanya hadn't been the end of a marriage. It had been the end of pretending absence could be negotiated into love. What he had now wasn't loud. It wasn't guaranteed. It wasn't held together by paperwork or expectations. It was built out of presence, out of choosing not to disappear, out of lingering when things were uncomfortable and staying curious when they were easy. For the first time in his adult life, Marshal Kurt wasn't maintaining someone else's world while neglecting his own. He was home, and he knew, quietly, steadily, that this time he was exactly where he meant to be.